while the last couple people are joining us, we'll go ahead and do some welcomes and some quick housekeeping things, and then we're going to launch right in. Today in the Directors Roundtable, we're going to focus on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and specifically racism, and how to lead students and staff during this time. This session will be recorded and posted later. Generally, the chat is very active in these sessions, and so I encourage you to use that to pose questions to the panelists, share resources that have been helpful to you, and then towards the end of the session, I'll remind everyone how to save the chat so that those links and different resources are available to you. So let's go ahead and get started. You know, as we all know, COVID-19 once again brought to the forefront the health inequities among different groups in this country, and then the killing of George Floyd and others has once again put a spotlight on racism and police brutality experienced by Black communities and communities of color. So in NIRSA, we've been developing a number of strategies and actions to further our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. This will include strategies that focus on the association as well as the profession. It is our aim, as always, to do this work with members and with our communities, communities of color, other marginalized groups, as well as with the entire NIRSA membership. Many of you have had a chance to attend some of the initial caucuses we've launched, and more of those are being continually planned. You can find those on the Ideas in Motion page on the NIRSA website, so keep watching that. Out of this initial feedback, through the caucuses, through talking with different NIRSA members, one of the immediate asks was a space for directors and leaders in campus recreation to get together and talk about and share strategies about leading students and leading staff through this journey of advancing our knowledge of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and then of course our actions, making sure that we're creating more inclusive environments in campus recreation. So today I'm really pleased that we're joined by 4 of our leaders today in campus recreation who are going to share some of their strategies, their learnings in this work. We had originally scheduled André Love from University of Alabama to join the call. Unfortunately, he had a family situation come up that he's got to take care of this morning, so he won't be joining us. But we've got 4 other esteemed colleagues on the call. So with us today is Iisha Voltz from Texas Southern University. Texas Southern is one of our founding HBCU members, and Iisha's been the director there for a while. We also have Kevin George from Rowan University in New Jersey. We have Wendy Motch-Ellis, who's now at University of North Carolina, Asheville. She was also the EDI Commission co-chair for NIRSA and editor of our EDI resource guide. And then we have George Brown from University of Minnesota, who's currently serving as the co-chair of our Health and Wellbeing Task Force. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us today. So we want to start off with a little bit of the why. We know that equity, diversity, and inclusion is imperative. It's a core value for NIRSA. It's a core value for higher education. It's deeply connected to health and well-being. It's really an underpinning, I think, of a just society where all have the opportunity to thrive. But we also know that for communities of color and other marginalized groups, we're far from that vision. So we're going to make the assumption that this audience, or most of this audience, understands and believes the why for work in EDI generally and broadly. But I want to open it up by asking our panelists to comment kind of more specifically about what's the why for campus recreation? Why is it important for us to be leaders in creative, inclusive communities? And what's the unique opportunity for campus rec? So Iisha, why don't you kick us off?
Okay. I think overall, campus recreation know the why. I think we universally have developed programs that reflects the population or your demographics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, I think the issue comes when that action doesn't reflect the message. And we have to be vigilant to ask ourselves these questions, especially as directors. Are our programs geared towards the demographics of our university? Does our staffing show the proportion of our demographics? And does the staff training provide the necessary tools for our staff to deal with the demographics on our campus. So I think that's the going more deep into the why as into sharing what we do.
Great, thank you. Kevin, how does this show up for you?
Yeah, I think just with the evaluation of higher education in general right now with COVID-19 and virtual learning environments, I think we need to really justify the in-person opportunities that we can create and justify, because students are at this time where they're being exposed to individuals that may not be like them and trying to find their authentic selves. And sometimes that away from home opportunities for some of those individuals can really open their eyes up to opportunities. But I think Campus Rec, we can be the leaders in this. We can identify through our assessments and our trainings and our workshops and our programs how we want to be an inclusive community and providing the well-being opportunities. And I think it's very important that we show that and we identify our outcomes and our work to show, whether you exceed or meet your campus population with demographics, and then really just looking at the outcomes for providing thriving opportunities for all of our diverse populations. So I just think this is the time now that they're evaluating student life and student affairs and campus recreation. And I think, again, if we can be the leaders and show our upper level administration how we are taking the lead in this, because we know higher ed can be reactionary with Black Lives Matters and all this DEI work. So we want to make sure as Campus Rec leaders that not only do we weave it into our staff and our programs and our participants, but how we can assess that and show the outcomes for a greater good.
Thanks, Kevin. I really like that. I heard, I think it was the UC Chancellor the other day saying this is a movement, not a moment. Right? And if we can be part of ensuring that this is a movement, not a moment for our higher ed communities, that's a really good thing we can do. Wendy, how about you?
Yeah, so I think, echoing that movement, this is a long haul process that we are really engaging in. And I think it's a transformational time. I go back a lot to NIRSA's adoption of our strategic values back in 2012. And when I started in Campus Rec, we really were the neutral Switzerland on campus. The model was kind of leave your baggage at the door. Everybody plays together, has fun together. We focus on sportsmanship and respect. And what we've learned along the way is that identities matter, and we need to be much more cognizantly aware of those various identities and needs and desires and interests of folks coming into our spaces. And so we have to open ourselves up to learning and developing competencies in those areas. Through the work with the EDI Commission, we talked very poignantly with the board about the need for EDI competencies to be part of our fabric, just like risk management principles are part of our fabric, that we can't rely on the multicultural centers on campus or other experts to always be the ones leading and doing this work. We have a captive audience. We have one of the largest captive audiences on campus, whether it be by vast numbers of student employees or participants just coming in and utilizing our spaces. We are part of the educational mission of the university. And so with that responsibility, if we're truly working towards creating healthy communities and healthy individuals to truly thrive and reach their fullest potential, we can't ignore or whitewash those identities. We have to bring our whole selves to the table and create environments and structures and policies and behaviors that really are truly not only inclusive, but then work towards really advocating and incorporating everybody's best selves in everything that we do.
Thank you, Wendy. Well said. George, what's your why?
Wow, when you back clean up after this group, there's a lot of great information there. Pam, and to the 60 people on the call, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm very honored to be a part of this group. I think looking at this also from a health and well-being lens for me, and that's where I try to do this. This is absolutely the same, but much more pervasive and insidious public health crisis that we have seen for the last 5 to 6 months. And I think the competitive advantage, if you will, that collegiate recreation has and the why is that we can attack systemic racism. We can attack social injustice with the same level of rigor and vigor that we are doing as we frantically try to reopen our facilities and make some semblance of programs. As my colleagues have said, the eyes are on us. We're the one place on campus that everybody's hoping has some sense of normalcy. We have an absolute moment in time to take institutionalized racism injustice and systematic wide inequality and apply it through a lens that's going to set and lead the bar. Why? Because the exact same thing we do with every nuance of cleaning equipment, distancing things, we can apply that same level of precision and practicality to not letting any stone be unturned in terms of making this a more just and equal aspect of higher education. If we apply the same doctrine of risk management to this particular public health crisis, we will move the needle on this. And that's the why for me, just using a very ecological approach, starting with the individual. I know my colleagues and I are going to talk a little bit as the questions progress about how do we start this? And I think it starts fundamentally at the individual. For me, the why is an ecological approach, but use the exact same public health doctrine here.
Sorry, get myself off mute. Yeah, you know, the same principles of behavior change that we've applied to health or to physical activity or to, you know, getting people to choose healthy habits can be applied here. Thanks for that, George. So, you know, Wendy said it well. You know, there was a time in campus recreation, generally speaking, where you checked your identities at the board. You know, I used to hear things like, if you can play, you can play, right? Or we're all the same, getting out of the pool, soaking wet. And in more recent years, we come to understand how that's actually limiting, how that actually isn't inclusive. So I want to talk a little bit about, with our panelists, about how has that shown up in their rec at Center and how have they moved through that as they've gotten specific requests. So George, let's come back to you and talk about some of the experiences you've had there.
Yeah, I think your analogy there to seeing no color, seeing no race, seeing no ethnicity. I think that I loved Wendy's analogy of Switzerland. I've actually used that before, that we try so ardently to be neutral and that we try to be apolitical in this stance. And my stance now, and maybe it's a product of being in the Twin Cities where George Floyd's murder was front and center. And we are, as many campuses across the country, and will continue to deal with that. I don't think the time for neutrality is any longer. I think college recreation, as I said before, is very uniquely positioned for this. You know, equity through physical activity, we've long known that. I think we've now woke up to the idea that equality through social well-being is incredibly important, and that we have a bully pulpit here that is, quite frankly, unique to our campuses. I think unions, I think residence halls, I think dining areas, they really look to us and say, oh my gosh, you're the place that, what, 70-75% for a lot of you guys are seeing those kinds of magnificent numbers. I'm going to suggest you're going to see those same numbers, perhaps even higher in some cases, because it may be the only game in town. So collegiate recreation has got this incredible moment in time to be something more than where the weight machines are distance. It's where the people actually come together. And I, you know, this is a moment in a lifetime for us, guys. As much as we rue getting open under these incredible circumstances, this is a moment in time for us to bring people together. And I don't think we're going to cure it all. I'm not Pollyanna about this, but I know we can move it a lot further than it is, because we are seen from that moment of neutrality. But I think we have to take it beyond that and say it's not enough to be inclusive. We have to strive for equality.
Kevin, you had an experience on your campus with being asked for some accommodations. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we look at our mission statements, ours says a safe, welcoming, inclusive environment. We really need to take that and be proactive versus reactive. And that's just something, we're all busy, we're understaffed, everyone's trying to keep things going. But we had a request last year from a professor requesting Muslim swim hours, and that's something that had not been on our mind to accommodate. We did not survey and assess the needs of our faculty, staff, and our students, and that's something, you know, we wanted to go above and beyond to accommodate, but knowing all the parameters and even the things that came out of that, whether it's access and they have to have a membership, and but it's also for them working with us and saying, okay, well, we're going to call it gender only swim, but when we talk about trans and other individuals' identifications, there was a lot of work that had to come about and working with those individuals that would requested that. But again, it was a good learning lesson for us to say, well, why didn't we know this beforehand? And when we want to support health and well-being for all individuals, we need to think about how we can gather that information versus always, because again, some people may not know how to request. They probably go to athletics or a different population. And so it's important for us to be as proactive as possible. And then what are the great outcomes from that? And how does that show that we are inclusive and welcoming? But again, there's a lot of moving parts from that, and maybe unintended consequences, or if a person that identifies but maybe not physically look from individuals using the pool and what that creates. But a lot of moving parts with having lifeguards that identify based on the gender-only swim, and informing people with offices and windows. We had to kind of black out the windows from the hallway where a lot of people like to look down in the pool. But a good learning lesson, that's just one example. There's a million types of examples where we talk about physical disabilities to religious. So there's a lot of great opportunities that we can be the leaders, as we had mentioned before.
Yeah, and I like what Kevin said about, sometimes you find yourself in a position where you're being reactive, right? And you need to move through that space, but then using that as motivation, using those learnings to then try and be proactive the next time. Iisha, you had an experience where you had some requests that you actually weren't able to accommodate, and sometimes that's a reality. So can you share how that process looked for you and in your department?
Sure. We actually created what we call Tiger Serenity. That's a place where you can come in and unplug, unwind, meditate, nap, just something to help with the growing mental health population, things that's going on to help combat that. And we were approached by a Muslim group of students who needed space to pray. So we was thinking we was being proactive with, hey, this is our Tiger Serenity. This is a place where it's meant for that. It's open for that. And however, unfortunately, it wasn't able to accommodate their needs for the type of prayer requirements that's required within their organization. So we was unable to accommodate them space-wise, and it kind of sparked the question as to how can we say that we're unable to accommodate and not be insensitive to the needs of that student body, but when we're just simply gridlocked on that. So we did find a temporary space within our facility, but it had to be temporary due to other needs of that space. So it was kind of a go back to the drawing board type thing where you want to help and you want to be inclusive as much as possible to your demographics and to your student population, but what is that when you're unable to accommodate?
Yeah, and then ultimately having that student group, feel like you tried your best, that you were truly listening, that you looked at all options. This wasn't performative. Wendy, you've had some experience with this as well. Do you want to add anything?
I think as we're working with student groups and really at this point, how we integrate and accommodate various needs that we have, it truly is being able to show up in a very authentic way in terms of listening and hearing various needs and interests, and then looking at what things you are able to accommodate. There are some things where you may have a group of students that is perpetuating a behavior or attitude that you're just not going to accommodate. It's just not appropriate. There are other things that are legitimate needs that accommodate a person's identity that belong in the space on a college campus where you really want to exhaust every option and possibility. We may not be able to accommodate everything in the campus rec centers, but I think where I've had great success with groups is when we work together to really identify the need and then really work to find every option and alternative available on campus and possibly with local resources and community to present alternatives. I've even worked with groups where we couldn't do something on campus. We found a local community option and then we funded transportation for that group. So it's really thinking outside the box and looking at how, if we're truly committed to helping students engage and meet their needs in the best way they can, that we find a way to help bring solutions to the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really like that example of not limiting yourself to, the four walls of the rec center, the fields that you control, really working not only across campus, but even off campus when needed to present different options and alternatives. Thanks for everyone who's chiming into the chat. There's a great conversation going in there as well. I want to move on a little bit into some specifics and some concrete examples of how to advance equity, diversity, inclusion in campus recreation as directors. How do we activate this work? So let's start with ourselves. How do we activate this work in ourselves? How do we create our own learning journey, et cetera? So Iisha, I'll have you kick us off.
I feel like it's important to actually think about what your stance, your true stance in any situation, in any issue that comes up. As a leader, you have to have a stance to stand by. So you have to really embed in yourself or invest in yourself as to what do you truly believe, why, go back to that question, the why are you in campus recreation? What's the purpose of campus recreation? Who are you reaching within campus recreation? And what can you provide? What skills can you provide? What leadership can you provide within campus recreation? So it starts with you, and everything else trickles down from the staffing you hire, and then from down, trickle down from the student staffing that you train, and trickle down to the patrons that you are patronizing within your facility. So it always starts with you as a leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Kevin, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that had a lot to do with self-reflection and identities. As an adopted Asian from Korea, I grew up in a predominantly white community. I grew up with it, went to college in a predominantly white community. So there's a lot of color blindness, and really love my parents, and they took my brother and I on. But it's really, there was no push for me to look at my identity and explore it and be proud of it. But there wasn't any, I think like racism, it was just more of like, well, we were bullied or, made words. People, I worked for PennDOT and they talked about Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, all these microaggressions. And at that age, as a 18 to 20-year-old, just didn't know how to deflect, just deflected and laughed along with it. And there's just been a lot of kind of reflections and thoughts about, okay, well, I need to look at myself as now having biracial daughters and how to support. We went to a peaceful protest for Black Lives Matters, and letting them know at a young age, at 5 years old and 9 years old, the importance of equity, diversity, inclusion. So I think there's still a lot of work I need to do for my own identity, and as a cisgender, and all the things that we think about our identities, and making sure that we have those real authentic conversations for those that we are around, whether that's family, friends, and colleagues. But then I think as a departmental leader, it's so important to be vulnerable and share your past experiences, maybe your implicit biases, and how we can and be authentic and real and have those good conversations. We are very fortunate to have a Black female that works for us, and I think that's been eye-opening. She said, I want you to see me for who I am, not just the position and the person. That's so important. And again, I'm so grateful that I work in higher education, where my eyes have just been opened multiple times about well-being and equity, diversity, and inclusion, and just grateful that I can have the opportunity to not only lead our team, but the impact, especially to our participants, from faculty, staff, and students.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Wendy, you've done a lot of self-reflection and learning journey. What would you like to share with the group?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. Echoing where it starts from self, but I want to take us even a little bit further into self before we're even in director roles. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask everyone to take a big, deep breath, because this work is hard, and this work is messy, and it's uncomfortable. Some of the things that I'm currently leaning into is better understanding around white culture. And a lot of times we don't like to talk about white culture, or we don't think that there's a white culture that exists. And I think as I'm leaning more and more into this work, and have done a lot of work around a lot of various identities, if you all have looked at like the identity wheel and some of the most salient identities, we're really at a space right now where we are talking about race, and we're talking about racism and how we support and create opportunities for equity. And I think it's important that we're cognizant of being aware of what's called the off-ramps, where it's easy to get off and go talk about other things, And I'm really going to challenge us as directors that yes, all these things are important, but we need to stay on the journey that we're starting. And this journey is about, first and foremost, unpacking our own whiteness, if you're white and on this call, and really thinking about what it means to be white in this country. It's not about apologizing or trying to fix what people did in the past. I think it's first and foremost leaning into this work about learning about the true history of our country so that we're not telling a whitewashed lie or perspective of history, and that we truly have knowledge and competencies around the realities of the world. We are not the only country who has had slavery, who's had racism issues, but we are probably the only country who lives a lie where every generation is awakening and discovering the fact that we have racism in this country because we like to pretend that it's not there. And as white folks, we have been socialized through school, through all of our interactions around white culture and behaviors that we're not even cognizant of that impact how we show up in our spaces and how we lead meetings, how we engage with others that we may not be cognizant of are frankly sometimes offensive to people of color, of people with various identities. So I want to encourage directors to take the time to first lean into where you are personally. It's not just watching 13th and reading how to be an anti-racist. It's doing the work to unpack how we've been socialized to behave and move through the world. Some work that I'll throw out there is one specific author, Tima Okum, does a lot of work around understanding white culture and white behaviors. And so you can learn all the history, but you can still show up in a space and be completely ineffective and actually cause more harm and trauma. And so unpacking your own white culture, your own white behaviors, your own religion as it relates to how you move through spaces. I go through dealing with my own identities of being non-Christian and being LGBT and being gender non-conforming. But those things still in and of themselves, yes, they've caused challenges in my life, but my being white has afforded me a way to move through the world in a much easier way in this culture, in this community, than my colleagues that are not white. And so if we're truly going to be leaders in this work, and look at how we motivate and inspire and create change, it does start with the self. For so long, we've talked about systemic racism and about these rules and policies and systems that are in place. And then we use that as the reason why it's so hard to dismantle. But at the end of the day, individual people worked to put those systems in place, and individual people and groups of people work today to maintain that narrative and keep those systems in place. So it does ultimately come down to personal responsibility and personal action to commit to lean in, not only to learn, but to really start unpacking how we move in our spaces. And we're gonna make mistakes, we're gonna step in mud along the way, we're gonna get the mud flung at us, but we have to be comfortable with that uncomfortableness and get messy and continue to grow and learn as we move forward.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, and like Erin said in the chat, growing is hard. It is uncomfortable, right? You do get, sore and maybe a little beat up, but we all know that's where growth comes from deep, significant, impactful growth. So moving on from kind of how this work shows up in ourselves, George, do you want to talk a little bit about how do you inspire or educate your staff around how to do this work, how to show up for their peers and for their students, how to integrate an inclusion lens into their day-to-day work?
Yeah, I think so much of what Wendy said and Kevin and Iisha as well, it does start with the individual. And I think it quickly moves to the relationships that you build. And nowhere do we have more power and impact than on our staff. Those of us, I think we're on a director's roundtable call. So by virtue of your position, your station, you do have role modeling capability. And I know we're all very much want to meet people where they are on their journey. And I think for me, I'll hearken to a specific case here at the University of Minnesota. Shortly before I arrived in 2016, Philandro Castillo was murdered in St. Paul. And it was a galvanizing event that brought a lot of uprising and a lot of angst and a lot of discomfort and a lot of scream for justice. And shortly thereafter, somewhat organically, Recreation and Wellness at the University of Minnesota formed what was called the READY, Recreation Through Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It was a catchy name, and everybody, it was a vogue moment, and everybody was impassioned and felt empowered by it. And we talked about what it meant through our staff. And to some varying degrees, we had staff who bought in, and they were there, and they would attend the regular READY meetings. They were going out and they were doing the reflective work, and they were becoming more educated and more aware of their community and the role that we played, not only at the institutional level, but within the greater Twin Cities community. But within a year or two of that, I sensed that it waned. And because of the very fact that it was organic, people came and went. Unfortunately, I think people became complacent. I think their perspective was we can control what we control in collegiate rec, and it became fairly myopic. And I don't think that it saw it. Well, of course, the events of George Floyd's murder awoken us all across the world that this is not to be a time to be complacent. And I think there was a fair amount of guilt from our staff about the indifference that maybe we exhibited between Philandro Castillo's murder and George Floyd's murder in our own community. This seemingly Minnesota nice where things come to you, and we tend to vote progressively on national issues. And so we had this sort of learned sense that we were okay. And I think for me, Pam, in terms of what that means for a staff, I have moved from a sense of organic to a sense of action. And I say that with a little bit of trepidation because before we got on the call, Wendy pointed out, and she said it on the call, we are in a place where this is muddy and difficult and hard. But I think our staff is now at a point where they're ready for that. And if they're not, we need to be ready for that. And I think as directors, we push those uncomfortable moments. I would say as an extension of learning yourself, surround yourself with people who make you feel uncomfortable. There are advocates on the University of Minnesota campus who I believe are pushing strong for equality. And that the idea that all lives can never matter until Black lives matter. And I think our collegiate recreation staff is surrounding themselves with that. Some are doing it in a very difficult, halting way, but they're doing that. And I think as directors, my primary job with a big group of 56 staff is to encourage those journeys. And in fact, sometimes have one-on-ones with those staff. And I know that sounds uncomfortable to many of y'all, but I think we're at a point where if we leave it to organic, we leave it to complacency. So if I'm going to err at this point in my career, 40 years into this, 30 years in the Deep South at the University of Alabama, now in Minnesota, I'm going to err on the side of action. And to Kendi's point, I'm going to no longer be a non-racist. I'm going to be an anti-racist. And I think that's where our staff needs to be pushed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, George. And I think as a NIRSA community and as a community of directors, if we're all willing to lean in hard and err on the side of maybe too much rather than too little, then we can really change the needle or shift the needle in the profession, right? Rather than George being the lone soldier or a few of us, being the lone directors out there. I really hope we can see some alignment in NIRSA, especially in NIRSA leaders, campus rec leaders, to lean into this work for all the reasons you all have been sharing on the call. Let's see. Iisha, you have also, and being at an HBCU, there might be some, unique aspects of how you ask your staff to lean into areas of inclusion.
Okay. One thing that I always note is when you're on an HBCU and it's predominantly Black, you automatically feel like you're all on the same page as far as handling situations, topics when they come up hand. But in all actuality and reality, we're not all the same. We're all coming from different backgrounds. We're all coming from different upbringing. So it's very important that you note that and be aware of that when dealing with people of color, and more specifically for this topic, Black students, because not all Black students experience the same situation, the same upbringing, the same circumstances, the same belief. So it's very important that you get to know your demographics. It's very important that you trust your stakeholders, which in this case, your students, your staff, especially your student staff. And that's one thing that I always focus on, the incoming freshmen. I always say the incoming freshmen because they let me know what's to expect, what type of personalities or what type of issues, what type of everything, based off our programs, based off of everything that they may bring. They're the new generation. So therefore, it's very important to note them, be aware of them, and also utilize your staff. One thing that I have done was develop, and I know a lot of campus recreations have, a student advisory committee. But my advisory committee consists of my staff, my employees, so from each area. And what they do is let me know what's going on the floor. Because like most directors, and I know my facility is small, and still unable to walk the floor or be available all the time and know what's really going on. So we kind of have that disconnect, but it's very important that we continue to have that connection. So if you're not able to get to know every staff member on your staff, if you're not able to get out of the desk, get from your desk and walk the floors, you still have that connection when you develop these student advisories, where you can schedule a meeting with them and listen to them and hear them, what's going on. They're your ears, they're your generation, they're your driving force. So if you entrust in your stakeholders, which is your student employees, most importantly, then they will be the ones that will keep you involved and keep you informed on what's the best approach to handle situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said, Iisha. And what I'm hearing in between the lines is then you really authentically listen to your staff with what they're telling you, because, I know I feel this way myself. We as leaders, we all think we're very approachable and non-judgmental and people can tell us anything, and we have this open-door policy, but that totally ignores the fact that we do have the corner office. There is a power structure. We do hold people's careers and financial well-being to a large extent in our hands. And so there is going to be, no matter how nice you are and how welcoming you are, some resistance sometimes to really telling you the truth. And whether that's from your students or your entry-level staff. And so to have strategies around that, I think is really, really smart. Wendy, let's talk a little bit about how we approach this work with someone, maybe a boss, maybe a staff member, even a patron, who doesn't see that there's an issue or doesn't see that their attitudes are problematic. How do you handle that as a director?
Yeah, so the reality is that we all think differently. We all have different lived experiences, and our goal is not to get everybody to think and feel and believe the same thing. As a director, our goal though is to set some very clear expectations around a certain level of knowledge and competency that is expected for all staff in particular to be in a space where we can work with and support all students. And so the approach that I take with my group is, my goal isn't to change your own personal opinions. And I also recognize that I have folks who, they don't want to do this work in the workplace. And that can be folks who are people of color as well as white folks, for lots of a myriad of reasons. This stuff is personal, it's traumatic, it's emotional, and there are people that are struggling with, how do I do this authentically with the people I work with? So we need to respect and understand that. But what I do set as a very clear expectation for folks is that I do expect you to lean in and at least learn. You need to learn proper history of our country. You need to understand and learn how systemic racism is embedded in our culture and how it is very much alive and well today, and understanding major constructs that impact our students and the work that our students are doing around things like the prison pipeline, the privatization of prisons, and that sometimes rolls over into campus rec. How we look at education around monuments and having conversations, because you have monuments coming down or conversations are happening, or monuments have already come down on your campus. And so my expectation is that staff at least have a knowledge base, and I create a rules of engagement expectation with the team. This is not going to be a space in campus rec where we are going to counter and defend other perspectives, primarily white supremacist perspectives. This is a space where we expect people to come in and lean in and learn and listen around what research and practices are teaching us about the world we live in. And then at the end of the day, you have to make your own decisions about how you personally might feel or believe in the work that we do. But in the workplace, you have to have a common foundation and an expectation around how we're going to respect and interact with one another. And so we have to create that freedom in that space with still clear parameters and expectations. And understand that everybody is in a different place. This journey is very personal. When you start unpacking your own stuff, it's hard. I remember in college, or actually grad school, reading a book. We read 3 things like back to back to back. The first one was Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Backpack of White Privilege. The second one was Janet Helm's Race is a Nice Thing to Have. And the third one was a lot more philosophically deep, which was Fier's book on Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And we had books getting thrown across the room. We had people in tears in our cohort group because it was the first time for most of us we even acknowledged or understood that we were white. Growing up, that was the last construct of how I defined myself. I was a female Jewish lesbian who was gender nonconforming. Where did white fit into that picture? Because all of my identities were impacting how I was being treated and experiencing the world. So getting to that place is hard, and people need space to do it. I would also encourage folks on your diversity groups to really keep them volunteer-based. I love what Erin shared in the chat around having different groups for those that are learning and just leaning in versus those that are really focused on action. One of the challenges I want to encourage folks to really think about is knowing that sometimes slowing down is important. And while the door is open and there is this idea of sense of urgency, a sense of urgency is a white culture construct that can be very dangerous when we act too soon and without good thought. And when I talk to my colleagues on my campus right now from my multicultural center and our DEI group at the largest level up to the chancellor, is folks are not ready to act. Folks are still unpacking, they're in trauma, they're trying to figure out how to do this work, and for it not to be performative, where you show up, you do something, and then you're one and done and out. We've talked about, things like weaving it into your performance evaluations, having it as part of your evaluation goals. But if that doesn't happen at every layer of the university, it's not sustainable. And so we have to have it become sustainable. The other piece we need to be very cognizant of is while folks are healing and trying to figure out how to do this work with a sense of hope, that it's not just performative, that we can't allow white savior complex to come into play, where now that we're woke or getting woke as white folks, we're gonna come in now and save the day and fix the problem. We have to support our colleagues of color and support them in helping to create the solutions and be side by side in this process. That sense of urgency construct comes out of this idea of those who have power and knowledge and resource just plow ahead and make change. That can't happen in this situation. It has to be organically systemic across all cultures, all groups, all races. We need to do this together, which means it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of energy, and a lot of time.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. We're going to circle around to Kevin on policies in just a sec, but I wanted to pull in Greg Jordan. Wendy mentioned community and how this is intensely personal, and it's not just going on at work. And they had a situation in Oakland recently that I think is illustrative of this.
Yeah, thanks, Pam, and good afternoon, everybody. I truly appreciate the perspectives of the panelists, and it is very, very helpful. And let me preface a question that probably is maybe best answered by George and maybe Wendy because of George's position there in Minneapolis with the situation there, and Wendy, your comment about mudslinging, because I think my eyes have been opened here recently that there's a wide variety of opinions out there. Let's just say that. So my question is, when community is trying to influence thinking or maybe strongly against an action taken, what are some talking points and some thinking on and dealing with community opinion and how it influences? And here's the background on the story. You may have seen an incident that happened last Thursday very close to our campus north of Detroit, where a white woman pulled a gun on a African-American family leaving a Chipotle in a parking lot. I think it's gone viral, it's gone national news. Well, the husband of the woman was an employee of Oakland University, and he was terminated. They were arrested for a felonious assault, and of course that is a pending case, so I really can't comment very much on that. But he was a colleague in student affairs, and I think the university took a very bold action by saying the action was inappropriate, not consistent with our values, etc., and his employment was terminated. Well, my staff has received phone calls or random phone calls from people in the community taking exception to that termination action for a variety of reasons. Our students have been bombarded. Social media, of course, is blowing up, so you can only imagine. Now, is it a race issue? Perhaps. Is it a gun control issue? Perhaps. Is it a COVID-19 related everybody's on edge issue? So certainly it's creating the conversations on our campus. And so I'm just wondering thoughts, maybe George, Wendy, on the community outrage of a different opinion, because the action made perfect sense to me that he was charged with a crime and his actions were inappropriate. So some thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly from the Twin Cities area, what's galvanized the George Floyd murder has been the role and reaction and the disproportionate power that the Minneapolis Police Department had, and how that now is playing into discussions around the University of Minnesota Police Department. And so you have an awful lot of people talking now on campus about what is the role of campus police, much less the role of city police. And I think these are the kind of discussions that need to be happening. How much force should a campus police department have? What kind of training? What kind of funding? And I guess from a community response, and I will say this, Greg, in closing, students are leading these discussions. They are taking this to the board. They're taking this to the president. And they are talking very, very clearly about what is the role of some of these structures of systemic racism and unequal power that law enforcement have. So on our campus, I think we've tried to turn it from a community response into what does it mean on our large community here on the University of Minnesota campus. Those discussions are going to continue to go on, and who knows where they will go, but I think that we need to have those discussions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wendy or Kevin or Iisha, is there anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, Greg, I would add too that what makes this even more complicated is we know that we have faculty who have some similar perspectives or views or may take action on social media or personally that are protected under the academic freedom side if they're tenured. This really goes back to what I was talking about earlier, in that this has to be institution-wide. Understanding our values as an institution and creating clear expectations and rules of engagement for the entire campus community. Because if a faculty member did that same thing and they were tenured, I'm not sure if they would have been fired. And I think you'd be having a whole different conversation. And so this comes down to looking at it at all levels. And that's why we have to be careful not to gut react and look at what is our commitment to equity. And keep in mind, equality and equity are not the same thing. And I don't think folks are looking for equality or being equalized in everything. It's having equity to have the same opportunities and access to the same information, the same resources. We are all different. We are never going to all be equal. But we have to create a space where we have equitable space wherever we move through the world, whether beyond campus or in the community. When I'm working with larger community pieces, I really go back to looking at what is our sphere of influence, which is first and foremost, we're here for students, and then for the broader campus community and then the larger community. If we haven't answered those questions as an institution for our own community, we're going to get eaten alive by the broader community. And so the place for us right now as directors is to be having these conversations with other directors and other student affairs departments and with your vice chancellor on, do we have very clear, committed values that we are going to stand behind as we move forward in this work? And then I think it's also looking at how we're then going to look at this across the entire system, not just for staff or student affairs or student employees, but also for faculty. It creates a double-edged sword. But there's going to be lots of opinions. Everybody's entitled to opinion. But if we don't have our focus in the right place, it's going to be really hard to really create change.
And just to add to that, is that I want to make sure when we talk as directors, we have to have real live examples of our own campuses. Just like when you do benchmarks, you need to have your own situations. And that's happened to us multiple times at Rowan. I actually had some inhibitions in this panel because I'm a manager. I'm on a one-year contract. This is a public forum. But we had a public safety officer who was a police officer, retired and hired at our university. And 20 years ago, he was involved in an incident with shooting a 14-year-old Black male. And based on George Floyd, a petition had come up and there was a lot of community support to not renew that individual's contract. And this is somebody that I had a personal relationship, and a couple people in our department had a personal relationship, and there were some feelings. One of our staff members, professional staff members, his husband is in public safety. So I wanted to hit it up and say, that's part of our agenda. We spent the majority of our meeting during that time to really talk about both sides of the spectrum. And for me to have to see that, we weren't there 20 years ago when this individual was shot, and we don't, but for the university to make a decision not to renew that individual from something from 20 years ago. So, but there's multiple situations. We had a local community pull over somebody, a person of color, a Black individual with tinted windows that they thought might have been involved in a crime, and they pulled out guns in our parking lot right outside the rec. And it was really eye-opening that our a Black female staff member had said, it seemed like nobody just left their workday, didn't even care about if it was a person of color or not, just they went about their day. Guns were pulled on this student at the campus, and nobody thought of it as a big deal. I'm just gonna go home and not think about the care of that individual. So just a lot of individual situations. I think when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's tough. Wendy had said volunteers, but it's tough because maybe individuals on your staff that need the most wokeness and learning about this, they're not the ones volunteering to be on the DEI task force. And in some ways, I kind of threw it out there. Some people wanted to volunteer. I said, wait, I want to make sure I open up it again to see if one of those individuals may get uncomfortable and an opportunity. And so I think it's just really challenging. I think we have to hit it head on and then think of real examples. When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion with staff training for students, think of real life examples that happen in your rec centers instead of just saying generally and broadly and globally, oh, well, this happens. No, when you can think of concrete examples that happen in your campus communities and say it happened 2 years ago, whether it's a mental health crisis or a suicide or whatever. So I think the more real you can make it and more personal, the more of an impact you're going to have. It actually hits them and they say, wow, like I'm going to learn and grow from this opportunity.
Thanks, Kevin. My apologies if my speaker's been a little fuzzy today. We have a few minutes left, and so we had wanted to get into policy a little bit, but I'm going to blend that into a question Mark asked on the chat, and we'll go around the horn, and maybe each of you can share concrete examples example of action you've taken in your rec center that you feel like has moved the needle on inclusion. And if that happens to be kind of in the policy systems arena, that's great, but if it's not, that's okay too. So Kevin, do you want to dive in first since you got the floor?
Yeah, yes, I just want to make sure that we do have a strategic action plan. We're very fortunate to have a division of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they had asked for all the departments to do that strategic action plan. And just looking at even like hiring practices, we went to a great workshop where it's about minimum qualifications, and maybe you not as a hiring manager, but you recruit people of color, or you recruit a diverse candidate pool in order to, kind of like the NFL coaches, you're never going to hire them unless they're in the pool. So, let those people know that, hey, we have a job at your university. And then you also need to respect that they may not exceed the qualifications, but do they meet them? And what is the great outcomes of having that person of color on your staff, and what it means for your department and the students that you serve? So that kind of was a eye-opening moment for me too, to say, well, I always had the philosophy, you hire the person with the best credentials and the most experience, but sometimes that's not the best strategy. Maybe you want to diversify your staff and what we can learn from each other from that. And then there's other things, again, reactionary. We had a student wearing, I guess what you call a do-rag at the front desk. And I would say 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said, oh my goodness, what is that person doing? They can't wear that. But I have to think we have to be more culturally sensitive, or people's hairstyles, and say, you know what, maybe our patrons may not agree with that, but maybe that's something that would be culturally insensitive or something about their identity. So, we've had to look at our attire policies and thinking about, okay, well, what does it mean to be inclusive and accepting of all individuals? So again, just aligning everything with your staff meetings, instead of being a one-off and say, we're going to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion once a year, weaving it into your biweekly or monthly meetings and say, it's going to be interwoven into the system.
Thanks, Kevin. Wendy, you want to jump in next?
Yeah, so recently we've been leaning into this work with our staff team, and I have a wide variety of ages, and some of my younger staff in particular, similar to myself in grad school, had never thought about my whiteness. And so this conversation has been a whole new mind shift and thinking about how to lean into this work for some folks. And they've had to remind me of that. And talking even with some other directors, folks have talked about, well, we're going to do this every week at our staff meeting, and then I'm going to really create some expectations of the staff in terms of action steps. And my staff have reminded me that we need to allow room for processing. We need to allow room for growth and reflection. One of the things one of my staff members said to me, though, that I thought was interesting, was that they wanted to have a heads up in advance if we were going to be talking about EDI stuff, so they could be in the right headspace. And my first response to that was, we'll see. This was to myself. I didn't say this to the individual. And as I thought about it, what I came back and shared with the staff was that I respected where some folks were at and wanting to have some time, especially working from home. They may not be in an environment where they can talk freely or candidly. And so we need to be sensitive to that while we're virtual in particular. But I also let my staff know that it's a privilege to be able to step in and out of these conversations if you are not part of an identity that is not in the majority dominant group. And so I want folks to recognize that and to sit on that for a while, and that we don't always have the comfort of stepping into these spaces when we're mentally prepared, when we're comfortable. And so it's a delicate dance as a director of how you continue engaging, but doing it in a supportive way where you're bridging people in to learn and not pushing them to want to run away from the conversation. And that's the hard part of what we do. And so just keep in mind that it's a long haul process. It's not a race. We get there in the appropriate time and space that it needs. At the same time, we need to have some expectations of where we're going and what the expectations are.
Thanks, Wendy. Iisha, what would you like to leave the group with?
Well, just to piggyback on what Wendy said, just to make, when you're planning or thinking about changing your system or your program, your policies and procedures, just make that conscious effort into going back to the why. And when you're setting things in stone, it is long term. It's for long term, not short term, not based on trends or anything, any agenda. You have to make conscious efforts of what you're putting in place, and also looking at your demographics of who you're catering to on your campus, because it might not be the same for everybody else's campus. So what works universally may not work for your particular campus. So it's very important to include your stakeholders, and like I keep saying, your students, your student workers, those people that your patrons that enter your campus recreation on a daily basis.
Thank you. And George, to round us off.
Yeah, just real quick, I would encourage and remind all the directors on this call that something you probably already know, but it's worth reminding you of. We are much more than physical activity now. And so the provision of social well-being, the ability to access students, particularly historically underrepresented students, marginalized communities, identities, they may be looking for counseling services. They may be looking for financial support. They're looking for ways to navigate a system that was built for privilege and basically benefits privilege. And I think the recreation centers bring down that level of us versus them. So I would encourage you to be wide students and knowledgeable about your institutional shortcuts, where students, particularly Black and Indigenous students, can find resources quickly that can help them. I think a lot of times our policies and procedures for rec are what they are, and we need to keep examining them. But sometimes I think we live in a little bit of a recreation and wellness bubble, and that we need to be attuned to what's going on in our institution to help students, particularly first generation Black and Indigenous students, to understand how to navigate a very difficult situation. The more you can do that, the more you have credibility, the more you break down those barriers.
Yeah, thank you, George. And thanks to all for staying on. I know we're running a few minutes late. Thank you for your participation today. A very big and sincere thank you to our 4 panelists today who were willing to share with us, authentically some of their experiences on a very important but sometimes difficult subject. As long as there's still interest, and there appears to be, we will continue to host these roundtables. Like I said in the chat, please email me with the needs for, your own learning and networking and resources, as well as that of your staff. We're not looking to replicate what your campuses offer, but offer the things you can't get elsewhere. We also recognize that, some of this education needs to be in smaller group settings. And so how we think about meeting people where they are in their journey, maybe potentially using some of the scaffold frameworks around EDI work to organize the type of education that we offer, and make sure we're creating the spaces where people can really engage. But I do appreciate all of you joining the broader forum today, listening to our panelists and asking great questions. So thank you, and have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.